You've studied wars in other classes before. You've studied wars in this class already, but nothing like the First World War. This is a total war. Total wars aren't just about the military. In a total war, everything is a legitimate target. Countries will use the totality of their resources. Governments will mobilize everything. The first and only priority is the war. Everything else is secondary. And that brings us to our problem today. This is such a massive event. And not only that, it takes place in roughly the same amount of time it's going to take you to go to high school. So to keep us on track, I'm going by the book today. Today, we review the parts of the Great War that the College Board explicitly expects you to know. To keep me from spending over an hour on what a trench looks like, I've added a new feature. See that there? That's everything the College Board says about World War I. Nothing more, nothing less. So today I'm going to go sentence by sentence to make sure I don't get off the script. And the first sentence we already talked about in the intro. World War I was the first total war. Alright, so we covered that. So what's next? Governments used a variety of strategies, including political propaganda, art, media, and intensified forms of nationalism to mobilize populations, both in the home countries and the colonies, for the purpose of waging war. And we alluded to some of this yesterday when we were talking about the causes of World War I. But since they mentioned propaganda and art, let's focus in on some actual propaganda posters from the time. This first one is American. The old man is seeing his son off to war, but as he goes, he reminds his dad to do his part and buy war bonds. You'll sometimes see similar posters encouraging people to ration this or that for the war effort. The whole point in a total war is to mobilize everyone. Maybe not for fighting, but for buying war bonds to help pay for the war effort. Or grow their own food so more supplies can go to the front. Or rationing metal or flour. Alright, next up is a British stamp. Not much room to write on a stamp, so they keep it brief. This is another way people at home can help in a total war. Don't buy German things, only support British businesses. You're not in a military war, but an economic war as well. And seeing that Germany had just surpassed the United Kingdom as the most industrialized nation on Earth, this has extra meaning. Next up, an Australian poster. So Australia is of course one of Britain's colonies, part of the Commonwealth of Nations. This one is calling out a common theme in propaganda. If you don't go fight them there, you'll have to fight them here. And Germany did have several Pacific colonies around Australia, so it's not completely insane that this could happen. Okay, last one, another British one. This is another call to your emotions. Don't let a wife or a family hold you back. Even the cult of domesticity says that the men should go fight for their country. Alright, so if you remember our discussion yesterday of the main reasons for World War I, focus heavily here on the nationalism side, and the way the governments of these countries prepared their people for war. Alright, let's see what else is mandatory for World War I. New military technology led to increased levels of wartime casualties. We went over this one a bit as well in the causes of war and those main causes for militarism. But since they don't mention much for World War I, let's double down here on the military technologies that could drastically increase the levels of wartime casualties. I'm just going to shoot a bunch of these at you in rapid succession. You may notice from our script that they do not require a single example, but any or all of these will do. First, artillery. These aren't just a bunch of cannonballs. Highly explosive shells filled with shrapnel were the most deadly. 60% of all casualties in World War I were caused by artillery fire. For comparison, at the Battle of Antietam in the American Civil War, the bloodiest day in American history, they fired 36,000 artillery shells. But on the first day of the Battle of Verdun, the Germans fired 1 million artillery shells at the French. And that's just one side of the battle on the first day. Also, that battle lasted for 139 more days. Second, gas. This was the first war with chemical weapons. That included phosphine, tear gas, chlorine gas, and most notoriously, mustard gas. Once the war reached a deadlock in the trenches, Germany, who accounted for 80% of the world's chemical production, decided to use their chemical knowledge of poisonous gases to their advantage. They eventually started putting gas into artillery shells that were fired, but the quality of the mass later in the war greatly reduced the efficiency of chemical weapons. 3. Machine gun. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. Not anymore. In World War I, everyone had machine guns. Setting these up in concrete pillboxes along your trench line with interlocking fields of fire gave no man's land its name. 4. Planes. Oh yeah, we can fly now. Kind of skipped over that. At the beginning of the war, planes were mainly used for reconnaissance, flying over and looking down on the enemy. There were also highly publicized dogfights between enemy planes. By the end of the war, they'd hooked up machine guns on planes with an interrupter gear, allowing pilots to shoot through their propellers and not crashing. 5. Tanks. That trench stalemate on the Western Front led both sides to try anything to break the tie. Now, if you played the opening stage of Battlefield 1, you know that these tanks are notoriously unreliable. They were basically large tractors with armor plating on a caterpillar track. But if you need to move across a battlefield, specifically across no man's land, this is kind of your best option. 6. Dreadnoughts. Look at these big things. We saw Napoleon's ship, versus the USS Texas yesterday, but look at the size of these things. These things are massive. They have a separate battery in the middle of the boat just for artillery firing. These things are super deadly. The problem is they're super sinkable, but they could pretty much hit anything they could see. The problem is they can't hit what they can't see. Which brings us to number 7. 7, submarines. Germany isn't landlocked, but their ocean front is right in the British Royal Navy's backyard. So they build up a fleet of 360 of these bad boys to use in the war. They're stealthy and relatively cheap. These 360 U-boats sank more boats than the rest of the entire German Navy. Plus, they made those big fancy British dreadnoughts and battleships useless. But the German overuse of U-boats is what directly brought the United States into the Great War. After multiple warnings, the Germans continued to use unrestricted submarine warfare against the United States for aiding the British. In February of 1917, they sank 128 U.S. merchant ships. In March, they sank 250. In April, they sank 423. In May, we entered World War I. Okay, I could go on, but you get the point. And looky there. We covered everything the College Board requires you to know about World War I. Spoiler alert, there's going to be a second World War. So much for the war to end all wars. And what happens at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles itself will lay the roadmap to the next World War. So the next 2 sections are about the interwar period from 1919 to 1939. Oh, and there's a Great Depression too, so good times ahead. Speaking of Great Depression, how do all the governments of the world react to the greatest economic depression of all time? See you tomorrow.